Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Montero with Strongtown Chicago. I'm here today to talk about a subject matter hearing that happened on single stair reform in Chicago on June 4th. This was the first time that an ordinance to legalize single stair above the current two-story cap in Chicago was discussed among aldermen and experts from the city. And to talk about how that hearing went and some of the major takeaways from it, I have Steven Vance from Abundant Housing Illinois joining me here today. Steven, thank you for being on the show.
Hey, Alex.
So before we leap into the hearing itself and single stair reform, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. You've been involved in housing advocacy for a long time, deeply care about enabling housing in the city of Chicago, and are really knowledgeable about the way that zoning and the building code interact to make that possible. Could you introduce a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in this level of advocacy, and why single stair matters to you at this point?
Sure. So my name is Steven Vance. I am one of the co-leads of Abundant Housing Illinois, which I joined about 3 years ago and then became one of the co-leads about a year after. But I've been doing housing policy and zoning advocacy and sort of research and contributions to different development of policy since about 2018, I think. My big thing was accessory dwelling units, like coach houses and basement units and granny flats, and trying to get those legalized in Chicago. And so in 2019, I was also on Mayor Lightfoot's ADU task force, and then finally saw the conclusion of that chapter in housing advocacy last year when City Council passed a permanent ordinance to allow accessory dwelling units across Chicago, which did go into effect April 1st of this year. So I'm very happy that I can just close that chapter of housing advocacy and we can move on to something else like single stair.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a relief to see some version of a citywide ordinance actually pass and be policy now.
Yeah, and then Abundant Housing Illinois was heavily involved at the very end of that, let's say in the final year of it, to spread the word, to garner support from the different city council members, and then working together with Strongtown Chicago, try to get more alderpersons to opt in their wards to expand the area in which Chicagoans can add these accessory dwelling units.
Mm-hmm. Because that was one compromise in the final ordinance, that single family only zones, the ward would have to opt in for it. But a surprising number of alder people have opted their wards in for those zoned districts, correct?
Yep, and I think I'm very pleased with the number right now, but I think over the next year, maybe 2 years, we're just going to keep trying to get more. It's just no longer the focus.
Gotcha. And so moving to single stair, what has made single stair an issue that you think is the next most impactful thing we could be doing for housing advocacy now that ADUs have come to a conclusion, at least for now?
So one thing that I've been working on, and also Abundant Housing Illinois has been working on, is increasing the housing supply at all levels of affordability, attainability, and for all people of all income levels across Chicago. So ADUs help with that, but they're not the most impactful. And I don't think single stair is the most impactful either. But the thing is, we have to try so many things simultaneously. And so single stair, a couple things that I think single stair does for Chicago and for communities around the world, because this is present in most of the world.
There's a lot of precedent.
There's a lot of precedent for sure, is that it creates better family-friendly unit layouts. So if you're thinking of the typical apartment building in Chicago and a lot of the United States, they look like hotels on the inside. The outside can look like whatever, but on the inside, you've got a long corridor, sometimes hundreds of feet long, with apartments on doors on both sides, and then you have these very long strip length, or like very deep units. And so when you open the door, there's no natural light that can reach in that far from where the windows are. But the bedrooms have the windows, the living room has the windows, but the kitchen and bathroom almost never have windows. And so this is not great for living in, and it also sort of encourages more single unit studio, one bedroom size units, and we are trying to advocate for bigger family friendly units. And I think single stair is one step to do that.
Trying to bring back the 3-bedroom and maybe even 4-bedroom unit for Chicago families that used to be more common in some of the vernacular housing types we had, like courtyards and multi-flats.
I think courtyards is a great example. We have, well, I don't know, I could do the math probably later, but I would say that we have maybe a few thousand courtyard buildings, and each of them have 10 to 50, maybe even 100 in some of them, of these units that have light coming in from multiple sides. And single stair is what enables that.
Mm-hmm. And particularly enabling more buildings on smaller lots as opposed to one big building on a huge consolidated lot, right? Because running a hallway down the middle to connect all of the units that only have one wall of windows, to make that worth it, you have to put a lot of parcels together, where most countries and most jurisdictions that have single stair tend to have only like about 4 apartments per floor all clustered around the stairway, which is why you have multiple walls of light, right?
Yeah, I think a good way for Chicagoans to think about it is, of course, the courtyard building, which many people have lived in and almost always revere it, their time living there. And I think another alternative for Chicagoans to think about is the classic side-by-side 6-flat, sometimes 8 units. And so you've got 2 units per floor, left and right of each other, and you have a front entrance that's in the center of the 2 units, and you have a staircase immediately there in the front entrance going up to connect all the units. And then there's often a back stair somewhere. It could be inside, it could be outside. But in the single stair version, there's just one. And then the space for that second stair can be used for storage. It could be used for more bedrooms. Occasionally, it could be used for another home in that unit. So instead of 6, it's 7. Instead of 8, it could be 10.
Mm-hmm. And particularly the 6 flats where they were side by side, because they still had to have 2 exits. Typically, they would have that staircase in the front, and then they would have kind of back porch stairs. But to have access to both of those, each unit has to run the length of the whole building. And we have very long, deep lots. So allowing one stair makes it possible to have units that both face the front end corners and the back end corners, right? Which, if the zoning is high enough, could enable more homes, to your point, not just better layouts. You
can totally do that. And I would say you can even do something else where it's have front back units with a stair that's in the center of the building. So you access it through the gangway or a breezeway. You enter through the center of the building. You can go, once you get to your landing, you either go left to an apartment or left to 2 apartments or right to 2 apartments. And then because of that flexibility that you have with this extra 100 to 200 square feet no longer dedicated to the second stair, you can now reinstate what we used to have, which are the light wells. Light wells bringing light in when your unit is not exactly facing the front or exactly facing the rear. So it just brings up so many options, new options, and also some historic options.
Yeah, new design choices that haven't been feasible for a while. Yeah, and so I think we've waxed poetic about the potential of single stair for a little while, and the fact that modern sprinklering makes it possible, makes it safe. Most of the cities in the U.S. that have adopted single stair, all of the cities in the U.S. that have adopted single stair above the 3rd story, which is what was standard in most places, have done so in exchange for the buildings being sprinklered as a safety mitigation and a couple other items. This particular ordinance, the modified ordinance that was brought forward and discussed in the hearing, would do sprinklering, would have a cap of 4 units per story, would have a cap of 5 stories, and some other technical requirements. So this is the first time this kind of reform has been discussed in Chicago. The hearing happened on June 4th. What were your main impressions of the hearing itself? Do you think it went well? What were the big things that are takeaways for someone who didn't follow along that you would want to highlight?
So I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, I was just excited that we had the hearing in the first place because Alderperson Matt Martin of the 47th Ward introduced the ordinance, I think in May of 2025, give or take a month.
This was the first version of the ordinance,
correct? First version of the ordinance. And I am not recalling any other alderperson before him introducing an ordinance to allow single stair in Chicago. So already the introduction was a milestone. Having this hearing a year later was a milestone. And so I'm pleased on both of those accounts. But I do want to talk about how does the hearing system work? How does the committee system work? So maybe we should talk about what committee it was and what are the steps before I get into more details about like takeaways from the hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I are advocacy nerds, and it's easy to take for granted that everybody knows how the mechanics of this stuff happen. But give us some of the inside baseball for someone who's not as familiar with how city council works.
Okay, so the hearing was held by the Committee on Zoning, Landmarks, and Building Standards, which we just call the Committee on Zoning or just the Zoning Committee. But it does include the other two topics, landmarks and building standards.
Right. The vast majority of the issues that it considers are around zoning, but when landmark and building standard, including building code changes, they go through that same committee.
Definitely. Probably 90% of the time they spend in committees is dedicated to changing the zoning map, changing the zoning code. And then occasionally when a topic like this comes up, they talk about changing the building code. And so this is not always a necessary step to have a subject matter hearing. Sometimes it's possible to go straight to a vote within the committee. And then after the committee approves it, it will then be reported to the full city council that, hey, everybody, all 50 of you, the zoning committee agreed that this was the correct action to take to approve this ordinance. We hope that you'll take our recommendation and just approve it as a full body. But this topic of allowing single stair buildings in Chicago has a lot of controversy, has a lot of misunderstanding, has a lot of opportunities to fully understand what the safety implications are. And so working together, our groups, and with the sponsor, Alderperson Matt Martin, we were pushing for him to ask the chairperson of the zoning committee to put this up for a subject matter hearing with no vote taken. And then we were able to help the alderperson prepare sort of, an inventory of speakers who could speak on this issue much more expertly than we could.
Some of those speakers included a city council member from Baltimore, which adopted a single stair reform last year in 2025, and a former fire marshal and firefighter in Seattle who's supportive of single stair and has studied how it's played out in different jurisdictions. So some of that expert testimony was enlightening. The Department of Buildings in Chicago and the Chicago Fire Department also gave testimony. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Department of Buildings was prepared for this hearing. It was not a surprise to them, which is good. I would hope that everybody's, seen the proposals come through and getting ready to speak on it and taking it seriously. I think they took it seriously. And I think the fire department was also taking it seriously. I just don't think that everybody understands the breadth of information and data and research that we have available to us. And that was a little disappointing to me, that they were prepared to be at the hearing, but they were not prepared to do the work ahead of time to know what was available in terms of the research showing that single stair buildings are safe.
Mm-hmm. And so the tone was a little bit more, we don't think this is right for Chicago. Can you talk a little bit about any evidence or any anecdotes that were brought in from that perspective, from CFD, which especially seems to have the position of leave the current code in place, don't change anything specifically with staircase requirements, and DOB, which is going with CFD on this particular issue?
Yeah, so one of the anecdotes or things that were said in the hearing was that Chicago has a history with fire, yes, very well known internationally, and some people brought up that fact and even enumerated some of the major fires that Chicago has experienced. The fire of 1871 was not really one of them, actually, so that's good because it was not relevant to single stair. But the thing is, people did bring up fires. I think one of them was the Iroquois Theater fire, the E2 nightclub fire, and which are not relevant and not those fires did not take place in the kinds of buildings that the ordinance is proposing to allow to have single stair. And I think Block Club Chicago for pointing out this fact in their reporting after the hearing. And so I think that's part of why we're here, is to show that, we have a problem. There are problems with fires. We are still having them on a daily basis. The fire department makes a lot of calls to building fires every single day. But I think one of the other things that one of the city council members who were, as part of their job, to investigate the proposal and ask the experts in the room, as well as the ones who were part of the Zoom, the ones you mentioned, the former firefighter and fire marshal, as well as the former city or the current city council of Baltimore, is to get at that data. What is the incidence of fire in buildings of a specific type in Chicago? Are they more in old buildings? Are they more in new buildings? And so on.
Right. I think the two major data points that are useful for evaluating this kind of thing is how many of Chicago's fires happen in sprinklered versus unsprinklered buildings, because all of the buildings that this ordinance would enable would be fully sprinklered, and how many happen in buildings with 20 units or fewer, which is the maximum this ordinance would allow, versus in buildings larger than that. And to your point, city council members asked that question explicitly, and there were some interesting responses to those data requests from some of the people present. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It seemed that city staff were unsure if the data even existed. There were mentions of how some of the data systems the city uses do not have that information. And so I'm just curious now, what is our next step? There's information from Minneapolis. There are other single stair studies that show it's safe. Some people want to point out that Chicago is unique. I don't think it is. There was discussion about the differences between Baltimore and Chicago. And so I'm hoping that we could collect some data for Chicago to show that, well, Chicago is really a lot like a lot of other cities for which we do have these studies. And perhaps we should do a better job keeping track of incidences in Chicago to make more people comfortable with the idea of having single stair.
Let's talk about some of the more qualitative concerns that people brought up in the meetings. One that were a little bit less on the statistics and the numbers and those kinds of things, and more of the concerns of what this reform could mean for fire response, for residents, for those kinds of things. What were some of the major concerns that people had that they brought up that stood out to you and you think are worth noting? For me, the thing that stood out was the conversations around smoke and smoke control. I think there was a lot of time that both DOB and the fire department spent on that, and concerns about what happens if smoke fills a corridor. That took up a lot of time in the meeting compared with what I expected it to.
I think with smoke control, one of the things that we've already worked with the sponsor to proactively address is by including self-closing doors, for example, in the ordinance. So if people have been following this, there was the original ordinance from, let's say, mid-2025, and some people who would know, like architects, commented that it was probably not the best written ordinance, which is fine. And we worked with those architects and with other experts to help the sponsor make modifications. And so he did submit a substitute ordinance, which people can find on the city clerk's website. And self-closing doors were added into that. And I think I learned probably about 6 months to a year ago of what self-closing doors means, and did not realize that was not more of a standard feature. And so I live in an apartment building with 450 apartments, and my apartment building has a self-closing door. And that just means there's like a very inexpensive part that closes the door automatically. And
it's usually like a little metal box with a hinge on it, a lever thing that makes it so that when you leave the door open as you're leaving, it closes it behind you. These are really common in hotels and other kinds of commercial buildings, right?
Yes. And so I didn't realize that was not always required. Mm-hmm. And then I wasn't really sure what the implications were. And so one story that some national researchers conveyed to me is that consider that you are leaving your apartment and you are stressed out because you're trying to escape. You're not thinking about all the things, the checklist of things you should do to prepare your apartment to be part of a fire in a building, even if you're not the cause or the location of the fire.
Right.
And so you leave your apartment, and closing the door is the last thing on your mind. And now think of your apartment was the source of the fire, the smoke is now leaving your apartment and going into the corridor and potentially going into other people's apartments where they also left the door open, or because there was no closer, the door didn't close by itself. And I'm just like, huh. So this is like a really important safety feature that costs very little. So maybe the ROI on this requirement is just like through the roof, like really good ROI.
Right. Door self-closers cost between $100 and $200 depending on the grade. So it's not a big thing for builders, but it is an enormous thing for preventing the spread of fire or smoke in the event of an emergency.
And then I think that you're better equipped to talk about the other smoke control feature or function, which is I think the skylight is how it's been pictured, or just something on the roof that allows smoke to escape through the roof.
Yeah, some other jurisdictions have dealt with, especially with an interior stairway, because an exterior stairway, smoke control and smoke building in the stairway doesn't matter so much. But for an interior stairway, how you make it so that if smoke does make it its way there, it doesn't build up, it has a place to escape. New York has breakable skylights that in its single stair buildings that the fire department could smash and allow smoke to escape in those cases so that hot gases and those kinds of things don't build up in the stairway. The International Building Code, its 2027 edition, which is just about to be published and allows single stair up to 4-story buildings, uses something called pressurization, where there are fans that, in the event of a fire, vent the stairway and push the smoke out mechanically. There are a couple of different solutions to this, but it is something that other cities that have legalized single stair have solved for and included those kinds of provisions.
Yeah, and I think something I remember from the hearing is that the buildings department and the fire department are not too keen on active interventions like the one you just described.
The difference between active and passive is whether the active one needs something like electricity or hydraulics or whatever to work versus being really dumb and really easy to smash or have work automatically if there's an emergency, right?
Yeah, and then another thing I remember, either the Department of Buildings or the Chicago Fire Department representative at the hearing saying is that they are ensuring that there are layers of protection that could be passive or active, but just a combination of them to keep buildings safe. And I'm thinking like, well, there are a lot of buildings in Chicago that have zero to few of those things, and we're proposing something that has many of those things. And so it'd probably be a good idea that we allow more new construction housing so that a larger proportion of Chicagoans live in newer, safer housing than in housing that has been old or is very old and has not been updated.
Right. That was one of the questions a committee member asked, I think, as well, as about how many fires happen in newer versus older buildings. So there's the number of units, there's sprinklered versus unsprinkled, and then there's how old are they in the first place as well.
Yeah, and so I'm hoping that we can do some of that data analysis ourselves.
Right.
I don't know how far we'll get, but I don't know.
Thank God for FOIA.
Is it so urgent that we do this right now, or what is the timeline for proposing, or not proposing, but moving to the next step of approving the ordinance for single stair?
Yeah, I will say that from what we've heard, it doesn't look like this is going to come to a vote in the July zoning committee meeting, and it has to pass the zoning committee before it goes to the full city council. In August, there's a recess for city council. And after that, we are now in an election year. Alders are likely going to be tied up with passing the budget for this year, which is likely to be contentious. It was contentious last year. And with preparing for aldermanic elections happening in February of next year. And so with that, it's looking like single stair will be an election issue. I'd like to know your thoughts on what that could mean for this reform and what that could mean for how much housing and interventions like this that enable housing could be on the ballot come February.
Yeah, so Abundant Housing Illinois does legislative endorsements. We will be doing them for the municipal elections in February 2027, and that process will start in the fall. Hopefully, we will announce our endorsements in early January, and maybe even earlier because the election's in February, whereas the previous endorsement, it was in March. And our endorsements committee will be in charge of figuring out what the campaign priorities they're going to be asking the incumbents who are running for re-election, as well as new candidates running for election, what is on their platform for increasing the housing supply and lowering rents in Chicago. But if I was going to decide right now what our endorsement platform is, I would be like, what are your thoughts on single stair? Should we adopt it or not? Should we adopt it in the way that Alderman Matt Martin has proposed it, or is there some variation that you would prefer as the future potential alderperson? And that, I think we have to do a better job as advocates to explain why single stair is so important to us. We didn't come out there to say we got to change the building code. We went out there because we keep hearing that there are certain cost barriers, development barriers, construction barriers to developing more housing. And we are also hearing that people want more family-sized units, and single stair accomplishes all of that. And one project that I like to refer to is there's a community land trust in Logan Square, and I think they do some work in additional neighborhoods, that proposes, and I think it's going to start construction soon, a 6-unit condo building that's going to be sold to families earning no more than some amount of money per year to ensure that it remains affordable for a very long time. And when I saw the plans originally, it had 3 stairs. And part of that could be a design consideration, that they really prefer to have a stair layout of such and such. But only 2 were actually necessary by code for this proposal for 6 units. So it's 3 stories, 3 in the front, 3 in the rear. And 2 of those stairs were inside, and the 3rd stair was in the rear and it's outside. And that adds to the porch system. But porches don't need stairs to be porches. And I'm just thinking, like, well, this is one of those communities where people have been asking for family-sized units when there are new apartment buildings being proposed. So if we took away 1 or 2 of the stairs and just left 2 or 1 behind, we could get an extra bedroom in each of those 6 units. And the other thing is, this project had to also get a zoning change to a higher density zoning district to even allow the 6 units in the first place, because this is a single wide lot. So that means it's only 20 feet wide and 125 feet deep. And it was zoned to allow 1 and maybe 2 apartments. And so it had to be upzoned to allow all 6 of them. And I think that that's another thing that both of our groups are working on. And so I think, again, you can talk about this better. So what is the relationship between the zoning district, the width of the lot, and like what single stair can bring to those situations?
Yeah, so the building code says how you can build something. The zoning code says nominally what you're allowed to build functionally. And especially density caps are a major part of that. A lot of a certain size, you're allowed a certain number of units per number of square feet. And so on a standard Chicago lot, there are parts of the city that have been upzoned recently, especially along commercial corridors, which allow apartments above the first story, sometimes on the first story as well for certain zoning designations, but almost always above the first story, that allow nominally on a single lot, on a single 25 by 125 foot lot, 7 units or 15 units. But there's no practical way to build that many if you need corridors and multiple stairways. There's just no way to give every unit in the building access to 2. And on double lots, it's twice that. So on a single lot on Western, where it was recently upzoned, on a single lot, you could have up to 7 units. On a double lot, if you have a double lot building, you could have up to 14. That's perfect for this kind of reform. With 4 units per stair, that's basically 3.5 residential floors above ground floor commercial, and you can fit that number of units. Without that, it's really difficult to hit that. And so I think one of the reasons single stair reform is exciting is because, A, there are already parcels in the city where this is the constraint that's preventing them from being used to build new housing. But B, as more areas are upzoned, and you know a little bit about some recent pushes to do this in parts of the city where it makes sense, it also makes building more homes viable there. Can you talk about some of the other corridors that this could potentially benefit?
Yeah, I'll talk about, there's 3 brand new ones, but I also want to hit on something you said. In urban planning jargon, we call some of what you said the binding constraint.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like one factor in the development process of that is stopping a developer from maximizing the rights or the zoning standards. And so you're saying that on a double lot on Western Avenue, which was upzoned to, I think, B3-3, the -3 is really the important part that controls the density of number of units on that lot, that 15 units were allowed on a double lot.
14, but yes.
14 units are allowed. But because you have to put in the second stair, you can't always find the space to put all 14 units. Before this conversation, parking requirements would have been the binding constraint because it's impossible to fit 14 parking spaces on this same lot that we're proposing this 14-unit building. But because of a series of reforms at the city and the state level, parking is no longer required in the vast majority of the city, almost 100%. There's just a few pockets. We will deal with that in the future. And so now we've eliminated that binding constraint, and our next binding constraint is density caps. But in the meantime, we're working on single stair because that is also they're integrated with each other. So if we can adopt single stair reform, it becomes more likely that we can actually build the number of units that our density cap says we are allowed to build. And so those density caps have been increasing across the city little by little because of a collaboration between the city's planning department and various alderpersons who are interested in seeing more development in their wards. And so just this month, in June, 2 wards, I believe, adopted the next series of proactive upzoning. And so we have a portion of 63rd Street in Woodlawn in the 20th Ward, and then portions of 75th Street and 79th Street, and I believe that was in the 7th Ward in South Chicago. And what that means is that those 2 alderpersons, 7th Ward and 20th Ward, decided that they want more development, and they realized that the current zoning was a blocker. And both of them, alderpersons Mitchell in the 7th and Taylor in the 20th, have designated a continuous segment of those 3 streets that I mentioned to allow, I believe, exactly the number of units that you said, because they're all being rezoned to -3. And so
7 on a single lot, 14 on a double.
Exactly. And 2 of those, 75th and 79th, are already commercial districts, mixed-use districts. 63rd Street is characterized in that area at least by some single-family houses on the east, closer to the metro tracks, and then quite a lot of vacant land on both sides of the street to the west of this segment. But also there, because of previous mayoral administrations proposing more development in that area, there have been some new apartment buildings built closer to the Cottage Grove Green Line station. So basically there was this segment in the middle that was just untouched, and the zoning was seen as a barrier to development. So I hope that we can sort of bring this message to that alderperson also, that single stair reform would be another step in the process to attract development to that block.
Yeah, you've already taken a substantial amount of political risk and gone through the process to, on paper, allow more homes in this area. This is the binding constraint that prevents them from being built in practice, especially on smaller lots without consolidating a bunch of them. I like that phrasing of the binding constraint. I'm an operations guy for a living, so the term I use for that a lot of times is bottlenecks. And it does feel like in Chicago, we've managed to smash some bottlenecks around housing recently, but your reward for smashing a bottleneck is another bottleneck somewhere. And so you tackle that next. It's both encouraging and frustrating sometimes as an advocate to be like, our reward for solving some problems is more complicated problems that have more potential, right?
Yeah, and some people, I think we get a lot of criticism as housing advocates. Well, at least I do personally sometimes, or at least I'm observant of it.
Sure.
That like we should work on something else instead. And I don't buy that framing because it's possible to do two things at once, especially because they're not always on the same timeline and they don't always have the same strategy to accomplish each of them. So if we're talking about two things right now, single stair and let's say density caps is the other one, as you said, single stair might be on a nap right now until after the municipal elections potentially. And so, well, now we just switch gears over to density caps for a while. But the thing is, we're not going to solve that before the municipal election either. So we just need to prepare ourselves on solving the density cap bottleneck. So then once we, solve single stair, we then are able to switch immediately back. So it is kind of a switch based on where the winds are blowing sometimes. And we're not always, we're rarely able to control where the wind is blowing, but we can be ready for where that direction goes.
And to your point about ADUs, it doesn't work as well in all places. The potential is not the same, but ADUs passing on a citywide basis was the binding constraint in a lot of places where that's the most likely form of incremental housing to get introduced.
Yeah, and ADUs, I think I said the task force started in 2019, and the permanent ordinance didn't go into effect until this year. So that's 6 to 7 years. And there was a pilot program for 4 years in between that. And it's not like that was the only thing that Abundant Housing Illinois, myself, or Strongtown Chicago advocates focused on. It was because you can't spend your whole time doing that. It's just that has to be a focus at least for a very long time. And so single stair is another thing that, it does get our members excited. It's just they're not going to stay fully excited forever. And so I think we also have to then work with our members to find the next thing they're excited about.
What would you say to some of the incumbents that are running for re-election, both aldermen and mayor, and some of the new challengers in those races as they think about what stance to take on this issue and what potential single stair has within housing legalization more broadly?
I would say please take a look at Zillow and their reports on rental prices and home inventory, homes for sale inventory, and notice how high they've gotten, how high the rents have gotten, how low the inventory has gotten. Chicago, for about 2 years in a row now, has led the nation in rent increases. Chicago sort of has this national reputation of being a very affordable big city that offers all the amenities that people want and need. But I think that we are losing that reputation. We are not going to be the most affordable, especially if you've been living here and you're experiencing those rent increases year after year after year. And then on the homes for sale inventory, great if you're trying to sell your home and move somewhere else. Please don't, want you to stay. But it's hard for other people to switch to a different type of living, from rental to for sale or to ownership. If you can't find what you need for yourself, your lifestyle, your household, your family in the areas that provide the services and the schools that you desire.
I think a point of pushback we get sometimes as advocates is folks say, you're very focused on supply, which could be important, but there are other elements in making sure that people can afford to stay where they are, especially folks who are lower income and who are already kind of on the cusp of being able to afford the place where they live. What would you say to some of those folks in terms of where these reforms fit within a set of larger solutions?
Proactive upzoning, that means changing the zoning map to allow more homes than are currently allowed, is something that helps every type of developer. A developer who's only going to do market rate, plus the affordable requirements ordinance that they're required to comply with, as well as a developer who's going to build 100% affordable housing, because they both have to go through the process to get the zoning map changed to allow the density they're trying to propose. And so I've thought of this new idea, I forgot who told me about it, and we're going to have some more jargon real quick, a LIHTC landing site. LIHTC is the way that you pronounce the acronym LIHTC for Low Income Housing Tax Credit, LIHTC. And those developers, the developers who are seeking those tax credits from the state or from the city of Chicago, have to show that they have a path to legalization of the development they're proposing to the state or the city to get these tax credits. And so we should be preparing these landing sites ahead of time so they don't have to spend all this time and effort to build the thing that we want them to build. And so single stair is also an option for them, although typically in the past 10 to 20 years, LIHTC developers have been going for much larger buildings that would not be eligible for the single stair. But perhaps something like single stair could sort of bring it back. And now these LIHTC developers, instead of building 100-unit buildings, are building a series of 20-unit buildings.
Yeah, the kinds of developers that build LIHTC buildings have increasingly gone to larger projects because it's so hard to make any single project work that they may as well go big for the ones they propose, so that if they can only propose 3 of them, even if one of them goes through, it's a substantial number of units. But if it becomes easier to build more middle-scale buildings, that's something that they could take on more of, presumably.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of Chicagoans would probably appreciate the more middle-scale buildings instead of large buildings that have to demand all your time and attention when you're trying to be a present member of your community and involved in decision-making on the types of development that the alderperson wants community members and constituents' opinions on. Instead of having to go through 3 meetings, should we allow this 100-unit building? And it's kind of like, well, what if we skipped 2 of those 3 meetings because we already had the zoning ready to go for 3 20-unit buildings?
For advocates who are excited about single stair specifically, what would you encourage them to do between now and after the upcoming municipal elections?
Well, if you're watching this before July or in July, there are a couple things to watch to get yourself educated.